Informative notice. The following narrative is based on archaeological evidence from excavations across the Mediterranean and Near East. Paleoclimate data from Trayering Analysis, published in Nature Journal 2022. Stalagmite records from cave systems and ancient texts, including Hesiod's works and days. Primary research cited includes work by Harvey Weiss at Yale University on Syrian settlements, studies by Park Williams on Mediterranean megadroughts, and Neo-Assyrian agricultural records from the University of Munich expeditions. All dates and events referenced are supported by radiocarbon dating and cross-referenced historical documentation. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. This story needs to be told. The year is 800 BC. The sun rises over a world barely recognizable from the glory that came before. Where once mighty palaces stood, there are now ruins. Where trade routes once hummed with the exchange of gold and grain, there is silence. The great Bronze Age civilizations have fallen. The Hittite Empire, rival to Egypt itself, has vanished. The Mycenaean Greeks are a distant memory. Cities that housed thousands now shelter hundreds. But this isn't a story about the past. This is a story about survival. About the years when humanity hung by a thread. About the hunger that comes before empires. Close your eyes and imagine standing in the Greek countryside in 800 BC. You would see small, scattered villages clinging to hillsides. No grand monuments. No written records. The people here can't read or write because they've forgotten how. Linear B, the script of their ancestors, is lost. For nearly 4 centuries, Greece has been plunged into darkness. This is what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period so desperate, so devoid of progress, that it seems as if time itself has stopped. According to archaeological evidence from sites across the Aegean, the population has crashed. There's no international trade, no art, no innovation, just survival. The Greek poet Hesiod, writing around this very time in his Works and Days, describes a world of backbreaking labor. He tells of farmers who must work every single day of the year just to avoid starvation. He speaks of justice crumbling, of rich men stealing from the poor, of harvests that fail and bellies that remain empty. But what brought the world to this point? Why did civilization collapse? The answer lies not just in human conflict, but in something far more terrifying: climate change. Not the gradual warming we discussed today, but sudden, catastrophic shifts that destroyed entire ways of life within a generation. Research published in Nature Journal reveals that between 1198 and 1196 BC, the heartland of the Hittite Empire suffered a severe 3-year drought. Tree-ring analysis from juniper logs preserved in ancient royal tombs shows growth rings so thin they're barely visible. The isotope carbon-13 levels in these trees paint a picture of unprecedented dryness. For 3 consecutive years, the rains simply did not come. 3 years doesn't sound like much, but imagine your crops fail in year 1. You eat your stored grain, year 2 comes, and you have nothing to plant. You slaughtered your livestock to survive. Year 3 arrives, and there's nothing left. You watch your children's ribs begin to show through their skin. You make impossible choices. Do you eat today or save something for tomorrow when tomorrow might never come? This wasn't an isolated incident. Analysis of sediments from the Dead Sea shows that water levels dropped by more than 50 meters during this period. 50 meters. Imagine standing at the bottom of a 17-story building. That's how far the water fell. The mountains that fed the Dead Sea received almost no rain. Entire regions transformed into dust bowls. According to Harvey Weiss, the archaeologist who excavated Tel El in Syria, a layer of wind-blown silk blankets the ancient city during this period. It's so barren that even earthworms left no trace. The land was choked with dust for decades. Nothing could grow. Nothing could survive. If you're finding this information valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to understand how fragile our world has always been. The collapse wasn't instant. It was a cascade. As harvests failed, Cities couldn't feed their populations. Without food, there was no surplus to trade. Without trade, there was no tin for bronze. Without bronze, armies couldn't maintain their weapons. As military power crumbled, so did political authority. The Great Palace at Pylos in Greece shows signs of hasty attempts to increase water storage just before its final destruction. They knew something terrible was coming. They tried to prepare. It wasn't enough. According to research published in Science Advances, the Old World Drought Atlas, which reconstructs moisture levels across the Mediterranean using tree rings dating back to 808, shows that such severe droughts tend to affect most of the region simultaneously. There's variation in intensity, but when one area suffers, so do its neighbors. There was nowhere to import food from. Everyone was starving together. In Egypt, the situation was equally dire. The Nile's annual flood, which Egyptians had depended on for thousands of years, begun to fail. Tomb inscriptions from the period describe cannibalism. One nomarch, an Egyptian governor named Antifi, boasted that his region didn't die of hunger, which tells you everything about everywhere else. People were said to be eating their own children. Ancient sources describe the land as a starved grasshopper. Sediment core from Lake Tana in Ethiopia, one of the Nile's sources, record a severe dry spell around 2200 BC. Brine sediments in the Red Sea confirm a major drought at the same time. At Saqqara in Lower Egypt, archaeologists found a meter of windblown dune sand covering what had been productive farmland. The desert was reclaiming civilization, but by 800 BC, the worst had passed. Barely. The world that emerged from this catastrophe was fundamentally different. The old order was gone. New societies were being born in the ruins. In Greece, something remarkable was beginning. Around the coastal regions and islands, Greeks were starting to look outward again. They encountered the Phoenicians, the master traders who had survived the Bronze Age collapse better than anyone else. The Phoenicians controlled the Mediterranean Sea from their cities of Tyre and Sidon. They traded in purple, dye, glass, and most importantly, they had an alphabet. According to historical records, around 800 BC, the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet to their own language. They added something revolutionary: vowels. For the first time in 400 years, the Greeks could write again, and with writing came memory. With memory came culture. With culture came identity. This is also when Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were first written down. These stories had been passed orally through generations, surviving the dark ages in the songs of wandering poets. Now they were permanent. Now they could be shared across the Greek world. These poems didn't just entertain, they taught the Greeks who they were, what they valued, and what it meant to be Greek. Archaeological evidence shows Greek communities beginning to organize themselves into palaeus. Each polis was independent, with its own government, its own laws, its own gods. But they shared language, religion, and culture. This was the beginning of something unprecedented. A civilization united not by empire, but by shared identity. Subscribe if you haven't already. This gets even more intense. But civilization wasn't spreading everywhere equally. While Greeks were organizing small communities, something much more ominous was growing in Mesopotamia. The Neo-Assyrian Empire. Around 911 BC, Adad-Nireh II ascended to the Assyrian throne and began a campaign of unprecedented expansion. By 800 BC, his successors, particularly Ashur, had transformed Assyria from a regional power into something the world had never seen before. A true military empire. Ashur-Nasirpal was a complex figure. Assyrian records describe him as both a brutal warrior and a careful administrator. He established food depots throughout his territories to prevent famine. He dug canals and built water reserves. He understood something crucial. You can't maintain an empire if people are starving. But his methods were terrifying. When cities rebelled, His punishments were designed to break the will of entire populations. Assyrian inscriptions describe impalements, beheadings, and mutilations in clinical detail. At the city of Tila, resistors had their noses, ears, and fingers cut off. Eyes were gouged out. These descriptions weren't exaggerations meant to intimidate. Archaeological evidence confirms these practices occurred with disturbing regularity. Yet, beneath the terror was a sophisticated understanding of how to feed a growing empire. Research from the Pester Plain in Iraqi Kurdistan reveals that the Assyrians implemented an agricultural colonization program. They established small farmsteads across conquered territories, settled deportees there, and forced them to cultivate the land. It was ruthlessly efficient. According to studies of phytoliths, microscopic plant remains from Assyrian provincial sites, we can see exactly what they grew and where. They didn't just conquer land, they transformed it. They brought irrigation technology, new crop varieties, and farming techniques that increased yields dramatically. But this system had a fatal flaw. The Assyrian heartland in northern Mesopotamia was what climatologists call a zone of uncertainty. Most of the region sat right at the threshold where rain-fed agriculture was possible. But barely. Annual rainfall varied between 200 and 300 millimeters, with interannual variability of 40 to 60%. In good years, harvests were abundant. In bad years, there was nothing. Around 800 BC, according to paleoclimate data from Kunaba Cave in Iraq, a shift began. The climate was starting to dry again. Not catastrophically, not yet, but enough to stress the system. The megadrought that would eventually contribute to Assyria's fall centuries later was beginning its slow approach. Make sure you're subscribed. The next part explains everything. Agriculture in 800 BC was nothing like today. There were no chemical fertilizers, no mechanized equipment, no scientific breeding programs. Farmers worked with simple wooden plows, pulled by oxen. They scattered seeds by hand. They prayed to the gods for rain. Hesiod's Works and Days, our most detailed source on Greek farming practices around 800 BC, reads like a manual for survival. He describes exactly when to plant, when to harvest, how to read the stars for seasonal changes. He warns that lazy farmers will starve. He emphasizes that you must work constantly, every single day, because there's no margin for error. The text reveals that agriculture was moving towards specialization. Some farmers focused on grain, others on grapes for wine, others on olives for oil. This specialization required trade, which meant you were vulnerable if trade networks broke down. If you grew only olives and the merchant ships stopped coming, you couldn't eat olive oil alone. This is why control of agricultural land became the defining political issue of the Archaic period. In Athens, which by 800 BC was beginning to emerge as a significant polis, conflicts raged between aristocrats who owned vast estates and poor farmers with tiny plots. Many farmers fell into debt, lost their land, and became sharecroppers or even slaves. The social tension was explosive, according to Solon's later reforms in 594 BC, which responded to exactly these conditions. Debt slavery had become so common that Athens was on the verge of civil war. The crisis that nearly tore Athens apart began right here, around 800 BC, when population growth collided with limited farmland. The Phoenicians dealt with this differently. They couldn't expand their agricultural base because they controlled only a narrow strip of coast. So they turned to the sea. Phoenician merchant ships sailed to Spain for silver, to Britain for tin, to Cyprus for copper. They established colonies across the Mediterranean. Carthage in North Africa would become one of history's great cities. Gades in Spain, modern Cadiz, was a Phoenician foundation. But most importantly, the Phoenicians traded food. They sold wine to Egypt, where grapes wouldn't grow. They distributed grain from regions of surplus to regions of shortage. They became the logistics network that allowed specialization to flourish. Without Phoenician ships, the emerging Mediterranean world economy would have collapsed. Yet even with trade networks recovering, even with new agricultural techniques spreading, even with empires beginning to organize food production efficiently, hunger remained the defining experience of most people's lives. We have to understand something crucial about 800 BC. Almost everyone was a farmer, and almost everyone lived on the edge of starvation. Modern estimates suggest that in pre-industrial agricultural societies, a single bad harvest could trigger famine. 2 consecutive bad harvests meant catastrophe. 3 meant societal collapse. This is why religion in this period is so focused on agricultural fertility. The gods people worshipped weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were the forces that determined whether you ate or starved. Demeter, the Greek goddess of grain, wasn't a metaphor. She was literally the difference between life and death. Ancient texts describe elaborate rituals designed to ensure good harvests. Sacrifices were made, festivals celebrated, prayers chanted, because when the rains failed, when crops withered, when livestock died, the only explanation people had was that the gods were angry. And if the gods were angry, you had to appease them before it was too late. The archaeological record shows that around 800 BC, Greek communities were beginning to build monumental temples to these agricultural deities. Not yet the grand structures of the classical period, but significant buildings nonetheless. These weren't just places of worship. They were statements of priorities. The community was saying, we may not have much, but we're investing in our relationship with the gods who control our food supply. In Assyria, the relationship between hunger and power was even more explicit. Assyrian kings understood that controlling food meant controlling people. That's why they invested so heavily in irrigation. That's why they maintained grain reserves. That's why they transplanted entire populations to optimize agricultural production. An inscription from Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BC, boasts about the feast he threw to dedicate his new capital at Kalu. According to the inscription, 69,574 guests attended. The menu included tens of thousands of animals, cattle, sheep, deer, birds. The message was clear. The king commands such resources that he can feed an entire city for days. His power is measured in his ability to prevent hunger, but this power was fragile. Research published in Science Advances shows that Assyrian agricultural production was probably already at maximum capacity by 800 BC. The irrigation systems around Nineveh wouldn't be built until the 7th century BC. The population of deportees that Assyria had settled in its heartland, eventually reaching 4.5 million people, couldn't yet be fed if harvest failed. The empire was building its power on an agricultural foundation that could support it only in good years. And the good years wouldn't last forever. Make sure to share this video with anyone interested in ancient history. What we're exploring here changed everything. The world of 800 BC was a world in transition. The old Bronze Age empires were gone, destroyed by climate catastrophe and systemic collapse. New civilizations were emerging from the ruins, but they were fundamentally different from what came before. These new societies were harder, more resilient, but also more desperate. They had learned the terrible lesson that prosperity could vanish in a single generation, that cities could fall, that writing could be forgotten, that hunger could return at any moment. This knowledge shaped everything. It shaped political systems, as leaders who couldn't feed their people were overthrown. It shaped military strategy, as armies fought not for glory, but for agricultural land. It shaped religion, as gods who promised abundant harvests gained followers. It shaped arts and literature, as the themes of survival, suffering, and resilience dominated cultural expression. Hesiod's Works and Days isn't just a farming manual. It's a meditation on justice in a world of scarcity. He asks, why do some people have enough while others starve? Why do rich men's barns overflow while poor men's children cry from hunger? His answer, which would echo through centuries of Greek thought, was that justice and prosperity were linked. A society that tolerated injustice would eventually face divine retribution in the form of failed harvests. This was revolutionary thinking. Hesiod was suggesting that famine wasn't just bad luck or angry gods. It was the consequence of human choices. of social systems, of how communities organized themselves and distributed resources. By 800 BC, the Mediterranean world was beginning to understand something that would define the next several centuries. Whoever controlled food supplies controlled everything else. The Phoenicians understood this, which is why they dominated maritime trade. The Greeks were learning this, which is why conflicts over agricultural land would lead to political revolutions. The Assyrians knew this better than anyone, which is why they built an empire on carefully managed food production and distribution. But underlying all of this was a terrible vulnerability. These societies were more complex and sophisticated than anything the world had seen since the Bronze Age. But they were also more fragile. They depended on favorable climate, on consistent rainfall, on harvests that met expectations. They depended on trade networks that could fail, on political stability that could shatter, on social cohesion that hunger could tear apart. And hunger was always waiting, always one drought away, always one bad harvest away, always one political crisis away. The Paeopli of 800 BC knew this in their bones. They had heard the stories from their grandparents about the time of troubles, about the cities that fell, about the populations that scattered, about the hunger that consumed the world. This is why the Greeks celebrated the Olympic Games, which tradition dates to 776 BC. This is why they gathered from across the Greek world to compete, to feast, to worship together, because they needed to remember that they were one people, that they shared not just a language and gods, but a common survival, that what had been lost could, perhaps, be rebuilt. Subscribe to this channel if you want to understand how our past shapes our present. This is essential knowledge. The transformation happening around 800 BC would lead to everything we associate with classical civilization. Greek philosophy, democracy, drama, and art all have their roots in this period of recovery and reinvention. The Phoenician alphabet would evolve into the Greek alphabet, which would become the Latin alphabet you're reading right now. The Neo-Assyrian military tactics would influence every empire that followed, from Persia to Rome. But none of it was guaranteed. All of it hung in the balance. One major drought, one massive crop failure, one collapse in trade networks, and the Greek Dark Ages could have continued for another 400 years. This is what makes 800 BC so crucial. This is the moment when humanity decided to try again, to build again, to risk again, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could create something better than mere survival. The archaeological evidence shows tentative steps toward complexity. Greek pottery begins to show geometric patterns, the first artistic innovation in centuries. Small temples appear at sacred sites. Written inscriptions start to proliferate. Trade goods from distant lands show up in Greek tombs. Each of these is a tiny act of faith that the worst is over. But the memory of hunger remained. It would shape Greek philosophy's focus on the good life, on what it means to flourish as a human being. It would shape Roman obsession with grain supplies and bread and circuses. It would shape every ancient society's understanding that civilization and agriculture were inseparable. The evidence from tree rings, from sediment core, from archaeological excavations tells us that around 800 BC, climate conditions were stabilizing. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. Rainfall patterns became more predictable. Temperatures moderated. The Mediterranean world entered a period of relative climatic stability that would last, with interruptions for several centuries. This stability allowed population to recover. Archaeological surveys in Greece show settlement patterns expanding. New villages appear. Existing settlements grow larger. The population curve that had been falling for 400 years finally turns upward. With population growth came pressure on resources, but also opportunity. More people meant more labor. More labor meant more land could be cultivated. More cultivated land meant more surplus. More surplus meant trade could expand. Trade expansion meant wealth accumulation. Wealth accumulation meant investment in technology, in art, in public works. This is how civilizations are built. slowly, precariously, always aware that it could all collapse again. Around 800 BC, Greeks were beginning to look beyond their immediate valleys and islands. They were establishing colonies on the western coast of Anatolia. They were sailing to Italy and Sicily, where they would found cities that would become centers of Greek culture. This colonization movement was driven partly by hunger for land, partly by political conflicts at home, but partly by simple courage, by the willingness to risk everything for a better future. The Phoenicians were doing the same, but they had a head start. By 800 BC, Carthage was already a thriving city. Phoenician colonies dotted the coasts of North Africa, Spain, and Sicily. They were building a commercial empire that would challenge Rome itself centuries later. If you're still watching, thank you. Please like this video and leave a comment about what you think drove ancient societies. Your engagement helps this channel grow. The year 800 BC stands at a pivot point in human history. Behind it, collapse, catastrophe, darkness, and hunger. Ahead, the slow, painful, miraculous reconstruction of civilization. The birth of Greece as we know it, the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire to unprecedented heights, the spread of the alphabet, the beginning of the archaic age that would lead directly to the classical age we celebrate. But this transformation didn't happen because of great leaders or brilliant ideas alone. It happened because ordinary people whose names we'll never know, made the decision to plant one more crop, to build one more house, to teach one more child to read, to believe in a future that didn't look like the past. These people lived with hunger as a constant companion. They watched children die from malnutrition. They knew what it felt like when the harvest failed and there was nothing to eat. They understood viscerally what we've forgotten, that civilization is not natural or inevitable, that it requires constant work, constante vigilance, constante hopi. The story of 800 BC is not a story of triumph over nature. It's a story of adaptation to nature, of learning to work within constraints, of building systems that could survive shocks, but accepting that no system is shock-proof. Modern climate science has drawn lessons from this period. When the U.S. Department of Defense commissioned a study in 2003 on potential effects of climate change, they modeled it on the 82 kiloyear event and the late Bronze Age collapse, precisely because these events showed what happens when climate shifts suddenly and societies aren't prepared. We're not so different from the people of 800 BC. We depend on agriculture. We depend on stable climate. We depend on trade networks and social cooperation. We're more technologically advanced, but we're also more interconnected, which means shocks propagate faster and further. The final thing to understand about 800 BC is that it represents not just recovery, but transformation. The world that emerged from the Dark Ages wasn't a restored version of the Bronze Age. It was something new. The Bronze Age had been dominated by palace economies, where kings and priests controlled production and distribution. The emerging Iron Age world was more distributed, more commercial, more individualistic. Small farmers and traders had more autonomy. City-states were smaller, but more numerous. Power was more dispersed. This wasn't necessarily better, but it was more resilient. When one city fell, others continued. When one trade route closed, alternatives existed. The system was anti-fragile, gaining strength from shocks rather than being destroyed by them. The Phoenicians exemplified this. They had no great empire, no powerful king, just a network of independent cities cooperating for mutual benefit. When Tyre was threatened, Sidon could carry on. When both are pressured by Assyria, colonies in the west maintained Phoenician culture. The Greeks would develop a similar system. Independent city-states, fierce rivals, but united by language, religion, and shared festivals like the Olympics. This network survived pressures that would have destroyed a centralized empire. One final call to action. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it. The story of how humanity survived its worst crisis deserves to be told. The year 800 BC marks the beginning of a new chapter in human history. Not the glorious height of civilization, but something perhaps more important: the moment when humanity proved it could survive catastrophe and rebuild. The moment when we learned that collapse is not final, that dark ages end, that societies can transform and adapt. The hunger that preceded the rise of empires was real, documented, devastating. Tree rings don't lie. Sediment cordis don't lie. The archaeological record doesn't lie. Between 1200 and 800 BC, the Mediterranean world went through hell. But the people survived. They adapted. They innovated. They created writing systems, agricultural techniques, political organizations, trade networks, and cultural traditions that would shape human civilization for millennia. When you think about 800 BC, don't imagine grand palaces or heroic battles. Imagine a farmer, exhausted, watching the sky for rain. Imagine a mother, desperate, trying to feed her children on too little food. Imagine a trader, cautious, risking a voyage to unknown lands because staying home meant starvation. These were the people who built the ancient world. These were the people who refused to let civilization die. These were the people who proved that humanity is resilient beyond measure, that we can survive even when survival seems impossible, that we can build even when everything has been destroyed. The empires that would follow, the glory of classical Greece, the power of Rome, the achievements of human culture that we celebrate today, all of it traces back to this moment, to 800 BC, to the hunger that came before empire, to the darkness that preceded dawn. Their story is our story. Their struggle is our inheritance. Their courage is our legacy. If you found this video valuable, please like, subscribe, and comment. Share your thoughts on what we can learn from ancient crises. And remember, civilization is never guaranteed. It must be maintained, protected, and rebuilt generation after generation. Thank you for watching.